Welcome to Speaker, the television arm of Freemasonry throughout New Zealand. I am Barry Rushton, your host, and we have an enlightened show for you this evening. Breaking with tradition, I just have one guest this evening because I know that what he is about to say will find a great deal of interest with many people. My guest is Dai Bindoff, a man who is extremely interested in the history of Freemasonry, the myths, the circumstances around the beliefs, both possibly accurate or completely false and irrelevant. Of course, closing out the show will be our regular contributor, Graham Houston, with a life and times of another famous Freemason. Welcome, Dai. It is great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Barry.
Many people have asked me about why did Freemasonry start in the first place? What was the reason for it? And is it still relevant in today's life? When did you decide to delve into this history, and when did you find or start to question some of the things in that history?
Barry, the thing that concerned me initially was that there was a sort of almost a mythological claim that Freemasonry started with the formation of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717. But in fact, we know for a fact that Freemasonry was practiced in England for many years before that, several decades, and had been in Scotland for several centuries before that. And it seemed to me to be odd that there should be such an obvious discrepancy, and I started to inquire into why that actually happened in the first place. Why was there this thing that at 1717 Freemasonry as we know it suddenly began? Yes. So it was that discrepancy, that the inconsistency that I wanted to know more about. I mean, the evidence is that Freemasonry was in Scotland in the 1500s, if not the 1400s at Rosslyn Chapel. So there's this very long tradition of Freemasonry before 1717. And that was what piqued my interest.
And I'm in agreement with you, because it seems like that we've only ever known anything from 1717.
Yeah.
And so, where was the hinge there? Why have people used that time? Is it just because it's a convenient place to start?
I think you've got to go back to the time, and I think it was political. Now, Barry, what I'm going to say is my own opinion based on what I've read. So there's no I'm not claiming this as a fact, but just what I believe to be a fact. I think it was political. The Stuarts had taken the throne of England. The Stuarts, being the monarchy of Scotland, had taken the throne of England with James I, followed by Charles, who was executed, and then Charles II and James II, and they considered themselves to the depths of their souls to be divinely appointed monarchs. So the Stuarts, although they'd fled England, the James had fled England and set up in France, their family still had the English throne. So there's probably an element of keeping things quiet about that. Then when Mary died, after William, her daughter, Anne Stuart, took the throne, and she died in 1714, and George I came to the throne. He was a Hanoverian. So now we had a completely different family on the throne, and the Stuarts were looking at that throne and saying, that's ours. And they were dead serious about it. I mean, they mounted several Jacobite rebellions, as they were called, one of which in 1716 or 1715 almost conquered Scotland and gave a nasty fright to the rest of England. It was eventually put down in 1716, but it had been a very sincere attempt to grab the throne. And then there was another one in 1719, and sitting right in the middle of all of that is this formation of the Grand Lodge of England, which I think is a political response to a political situation. Wow. The divorcing of post-George I Hanoverian Freemasonry from the pre-George I Freemasonry, which was a Stuart thing. Stuarts and Hanoverians at loggerheads, at swords points, they created a separation. And that's what I think the Grand Lodge of England really represents, and why it has become seen as a major turning point in Freemasonry.
Yes. You mentioned before about the Rosslyn Chapel, and we're going to get into that because I know that's extremely interesting. A lot of our viewers have asked us, what is our backdrop behind this show? And it is an image of the Rosslyn Chapel.
Oh, really?
That is fantastic.
Yeah, that is a fantastic
But getting
place,
back to what you were talking about, how did they then create that separation from the old Freemasonry into what was regarded as the new Freemasonry?
I think, Barry, you've got to look at a rather curious thing that happened, because I think personally this is the clue to that. When the Grand Lodge of England was formed in 1717, a fellow called the Reverend Dr. James Anderson was asked to write what are called Anderson's Constitutions, which is basically the guidebook for the new form of Freemasonry. And that came out in 1723, and it made a very passing reference to Sir Christopher Wren, who had been a Freemason. Well, according to Anderson, he'd been the Grand Master. I mean, there's some debate over that, but Anderson made the claim. And then George II's son, the Prince of Wales, who was going to be the king had he not died before reaching the throne, he became a Freemason. He became the first English royal Freemason.
That's right.
The following year, Anderson brought out a revision of his constitutions in which he included what he claimed was a history, which is largely mythology. But it was creating this new story about Freemasonry. And I think the clue to why he did that, it was to give it credibility, was that he suddenly attacked Christopher Wren. He said that he'd had to do this new revision because of the mess that Christopher Wren had left the old records in. So throw the old records out, bring in a new start in the form of Anderson's Constitutions. And they're using that excuse of Wren leaving things in a mess. Wren was a Stuart favourite. He obviously rebuilt a lot of London for Charles II. And so you have this sort of discrediting of the past and the new credibility of the new. So I think that's where and why and how it was brought about.
That for members of the royalty, they automatically joined Freemasonry?
I wouldn't say automatically, Barry, but there's been an awful lot of them. Prince Frederick, the one we've been talking about, he talked a number of the other members of his family to join, and there have been members of the royal family in Freemasonry, more on than off, ever since. Right. The current Grand Master in England is the
Prince Michael of
Duke of Kent. Michael Duke of Kent. Yeah. In general terms, yes, the royal family have associated themselves.
Great. I just wonder why they decided it was a good thing to actually part of the Freemasons Guild or the Freemasons organisation.
Probably reasons change, but if you go back to the earliest days, of course, Freemasonry got a lot of credibility as a result of being the founding fathers of the Royal Society, which was the advance guard of a lot of the scientific discovery that now dictates our world. And that put Britain fairly close to the leading edge on science. And as a result of that and other reasons for having influence, like a lot of aristocrats were involved, it was a very influential organisation. And I think that probably explains it. It was a place where monarchs could meet their equals, or almost equals, because the monarch doesn't have an equal, but they could mix with their own kind, let's put it that way, and also be part of what is influencing society.
And I think if you think again with the United States Constitution, the number of Freemasons who were part of the Founding Fathers in a similar time frame, not exactly the same, but close.
Very, very close. In fact, the revolution came in the time of George II. And we won't go into it today, but there is a speculation, and quite well-founded speculation, that England, whichever we like to call it, did not lose the American Revolution. They allowed the Americans to win, and the Freemasons had a role in that, because the English Freemasons and the American Freemasons were literal family members, brothers, and they didn't want this war. Yeah. So yeah, and Washington was a Freemason, Jefferson was a Freemason. And in fact, when Washington had an apron that was made by Madame Lafayette, and Lafayette then went and led the French Revolution. So yeah, all these things come into it.
Fantastic, isn't it? So Di, we talked about before in the early days, the cathedrals were made, so there were men who actually were stonemasons. But over time, there's a gradual change, I think, to where the speculative ended up being a lot of men of influence. Has there been such a great change from that entity to the men of power entity?
Well, to be honest, Barry, I don't think there's any evidence at all that Freemasonry came out of operative masonry. I think that's one of the myths, it's one of the assumptions that's been made in the absence of any evidence, really. The notion that they came out of the guilds, there isn't actually any evidence for England having guilds, stonemasons' guilds. I think the more likely explanation is one of allegory and metaphor. If you look at the people that were venerated by the people of the times, they were people who, like metal workers, for example, because they knew how to take a bit of rock and turn it into something sharp and blend bits together to make it even sharper and more durable, they were regarded as wizards. The people who built the sacred places out of stone were a special class of people, but not the hammer hands, not the labourers, but the master builders were clearly building. But they were accountable to the throne for building something that was going to be God's house, not your ordinary run-of-the-mill chap. So there is clearly a religious and a spiritual connection between the building of a temple in stone and what we actually believe in our own ceremonies, that we build a temple in our own bodies. So I think the allegory comes from that there. This was a movement where men set out to improve themselves, to perfect themselves, to be a better example, and build a temple in themselves. And so they adopted the stonemasons' tools and the stonemasons' words and doings and what have you to describe what they were doing. And I think that's where the crossover came. Started out being something quite high-minded and led by the aristocracy and by the royalty. And of course, they would all see themselves as the upper crust, and the people who from whom everybody else took their lead.
In the physical world, they took a rough stone and over a process turned it into a smooth block.
Yep.
And that same allegory is given to a man himself in his rough form over time, and through the workings of Freemasonry, turns them into a far better man of himself.
Absolutely, and in a Freemason's lodge, as you know, Barry, there is a rough piece of stone called the rough ashlar, and the perfect ashlar, which is squared and polished and all the rest of it, and it represents the mind of man in his declining years when he spent a lifetime in works of piety. So it is the polishing up of a rough soul into somebody who has become something of real value and merit. And that's the core of it, I think. Yeah.
Fantastic.
And in fact, it's stated we apply these morals, these emblems to our morals, and you can see how they've taken what the operative Masons used and turned that into a metaphorical message to the man who's receiving it. You know, this is what you've got to do to make yourself better. And there's an assumption that we make men better. No, we don't. We show men how to make themselves better, how better citizens.
They are responsible for taking the journey on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Superb.
But Barry, what an incredible act of genius to decide to do this in the first place. I mean, it's all very well for us to talk about today when it's well established, but these incredible intellects decided to do this in the first place. I think that's to me is fascinating.
And could possibly that fascination be the reason why Freemasonry over the years just grew to be such a powerful entity, a powerful organization, not necessarily powerful in the realms of power in the world, but as an entity of an organization of men?
Well, I think so. I think if you look at the makeup of Freemasonry for many years, and in fact probably right up until the end of the Second World War, it was very much an elite organisation for men of power. And these were men, prime ministers, for example, and kings and leaders of business and what have you. These were people who could pull a lever and something happened. They didn't need to boast about it. They didn't need to get publicity about it. They didn't need to recruit a whole army of people to do things. They pulled a lever of power and something happened. And so Freemasonry has, as we said, you know, through the American Revolution being one, the Russian Revolution being another, and many others, the Freemasons have been able to shape society. And they've done it, I think, in a very benign way. You wouldn't give that kind of power to men who didn't know how to behave themselves properly. So you teach them how to be good men, and then you let them be good men and achieve good things in society.
Now, of course, that does fuel that great myth, that that there's a organisation out there of Freemasons who run the world. This kind of stuff. It's a huge myth out there.
Oh, of course it is, yes.
But of course, what that really means is that when men operate to a high standard individually, collectively, things get done in the proper way.
Absolutely. I mean, the notion that any group of people are running the world is a nonsense, of course. And there's no evidence that Freemasons ever attempted to. But what they did do, as we've just said, is they saw the opportunity to do some good and did some good.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reality of it. And because they were mysterious and because they looked like they could probably make you disappear off the face of the earth, true or false, mythologies grew and the envious started stories about them. But to know Freemasons is to know that just simply couldn't be true.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Di, there's one thing that I would like you to, because I know you have been there and I have not. But I'd love to know your thoughts about the Rosslyn Chapel. As I said before, we're using it as our backdrop. Tell us a little bit about the experience of you going to the Rosslyn Chapel, what you saw, what it meant to you, and how you felt in those surrounds.
Rosslyn Chapel is perhaps the most mysterious building in Britain, if not in the world. It is a relatively small place. It has a huge end wall, which is much bigger than this chapel needs. And the mythology is that this was for a much larger structure that was going to be tacked on the end as a cathedral. None of that makes a lot of sense, to be honest. Structurally, it makes very little sense. And the idea that the St. Clairs, who created this thing, ran out of money is preposterous. The St. Clairs own the place to this day. And there is a fusion there within the stone structure of there's Templar symbology, there's Masonic symbology, and there is pagan symbology. The Green Man is everywhere, but there's also Christian symbology. So there's this incredible fusion, which I'm not, maybe drawing a long bow to say that this is an example of how Freemasons today do not care what religion you belong to, which is one of, I think, the most enlightened things about Freemasonry. But it's possible that was a starting point. But what is quite clear is the association there of Templar and Freemason. Philip the Fair of France had decided that Templars needed to be put down, and he set about doing that. A remarkable achievement in itself. The Pope wasn't particularly interested until Philip told him something, at which point the Pope said, "Well, spare no known means of torture," which is a pretty extreme thing to say. But obviously there was a reason why the Pope suddenly took this view. Templars fled from this persecution, and the only place where they were actually safe was Scotland. Ultimately that was Scotland, because Scotland had been excommunicated because Robert the Bruce killed somebody in a cathedral, and therefore the Pope's authority didn't extend there. But this created an embarrassment for Robert the Bruce because his best mate in all the world was Philip the Fair of France. So politically, he couldn't ever admit to giving the Templars sanctuary in his country. So I think he said to the Templars words along the lines of, "Hey, listen, fellas, thanks for all of that. Now you've got to disappear and re-emerge as something else. I don't care what it is, but just don't be Templars." And so Freemasonry emerged. And that is encapsulated, in my belief, in the Rosslyn Chapel. And I think that also tells you, or gives you an intro into why Freemasonry acquired such a high standing in society pretty much from the outset, because the Templars were aristocrats. The Crusaders, the Templars were the lords of the land. Now, if they had disappeared and re-emerged as Freemasons, they were still the lords of the land. And so I think that's a possible explanation.
So throughout history, of course, Freemasonry was a powerful entity, and it still is today. Do you still think tomorrow that the relevance of Freemasonry to the young men coming through in this changing world we live has the same sort of significance, the same sort of importance that we feel and have felt for a number of years?
Oh, look, Barry, I don't think there's any question about that. I wouldn't be here if I didn't think it was relevant and important. I think the key is what we're about is helping good men make themselves better, giving each man the opportunity to explore his own soul, his own morality, his own integrity, and grow those things. How can that be bad? How can that not be real in this world? Making ourselves better people remains relevant and always will. And I think that's why Freemasonry separately from the service clubs, has this role that it can play in the spiritual development of young men, and always will. And we're seeing that in the resurgence of the young interest, the interest of young men in Freemasonry.
Just last week we had a program of 2 young Freemasons who are just excited to be part of it. They love it, they're contributing to it, and they're the foundations and the seeds of the future. It's a terrific situation to be seeing.
Absolutely, and I know one of those lads, and he is a superb young human being, and I look forward to him being a leader in the craft one day. But also, I mean, I've got an Iraqi friend who is Muslim, who I'm going to introduce to the craft. We've had several Muslims, and they're fine, fine people. And we have Catholics, and we have Protestants, and we have, whatever. We don't care, because the unifying force is good men working together. And that, I think, has always been the key to good Freemasonry, and always will be.
So I want to thank you. I want to thank you so much for coming. You are a wealth of knowledge, and it is such a joy to hear you talk of things, and I'm looking forward to having you on the show again at some stage. I hope you will do so.
Thank you, Barry. It's such a joy to be able to talk and not be told to shut up.
See you soon, Joe.
Okay.
And rounding out the show tonight, of course, is our regular contributor, Graham Houston. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Barry.
Now, Graham, you're going to speak about someone tonight who I've got absolutely no idea about. I'm going to turn it over to you, my good friend.
You're right. And actually, most people won't have any idea about this person. His name is Prince Hall. He was born around 1738. And the obvious question is, where did he come from? Well, nobody actually really knows. And was Prince Hall his actual name? Again, nobody really knows. But he gained prominence in America as being the founding father of Black Freemasonry, or African-American Freemasonry.
When you said that word black, I knew you were struggling to find the other words, weren't you?
Well, that's how he referred to it.
That's how it was.
That's how it was in those days. Now, he was a servant to a guy called William Hall. Now, he was not a slave, but he was not a free man. He was a servant. And he was a servant to William Hall for a number of years, but in about 1770 he gained his freedom. He was given free man status. And from then on he went about town, around the Boston area, advocating and preaching about equal rights for the black people in the community, education for the black children in the community, and employment opportunities as well. And he found in doing that it was falling on deaf ears, because nobody would listen to him in the community. And he was of the opinion that nobody would listen to a black man. So he heard about Freemasonry. Around 1770 he heard about Freemasonry, and he made some inquiries. And the reason he started his inquiries, he found that Freemasons were influential people in the community, and people listened to Freemasons. So he thought if he was a Freemason, maybe his messages might be listened to. So he made inquiries, and in doing so he went to several of the lodges, and several of those lodges turned him down.
Did they?
On the basis of colour. And so he was rejected throughout the area. But there was a lodge in town that the worshipful master heard about his inquiries about Freemasonry, and it was of the Irish Constitution. He heard about Prince Hall, so he met up with him, discussed with him, and finally said they will admit Prince Hall into lodge number 441, along with 14 others, men of colour, as it was referred to. And that was the first recording of a first recording of men of colour being able to become Masons in America. Now, if we jump forward a few years, 2 of the members of that African Lodge number 1 were mariners, and they found themselves stranded in London and in some distress. So, being Freemasons, they approached a lodge in London. They approached the Lodge of Brotherly Love. And so the Lodge of Brotherly Love number 55 provided the assistance that they needed. On their return to the US, they told people about this, and in particular they told Prince Hall of the way that they had been treated by the Brotherly Love Lodge. Prince Hall immediately spied an opportunity, and he wrote to the Lodge of Brotherly Love and said, thank you. Thank you for looking after two of our brothers in distress. Appreciate it. And by the way, could we enlist your services to assist us to gain a full charter from the Grand Lodge of England? And it transpired in December 1794 that the Grand Lodge of England, with the assistance of the Lodge of Brotherly Love, granted a charter or warrant to African Lodge number 1. And that was personally delivered to Prince Hall about 3 years later. With that charter, Prince Hall then set about chartering other subordinate lodges. And I think it was about 6 years later, the African Lodge Philadelphia was formed, and then a series of lodges from there. According to all reports, he was so very popular. He was such a good leader that the Grand Lodge of England actually made him a provincial Grand Master.
Wow.
And so he became the provincial Grand Master of the African Lodge. He died in 1807 and is buried in Copp's Hill in Boston, Massachusetts. But you would think that there would be a lot of writings about this man over his period of life.
Look, I've never heard a thing. You know, you think we'd know, but we actually have heard nothing,
That's right.
not about him, but really about any sort of African-American sort of Freemasonry groups at all.
It's very strong. There are now 27 jurisdictions, sovereign jurisdictions of Prince Hall
Lodges.
Grand Lodges.
Wow.
There are over 4,500 Prince Hall Grand Lodge affiliates.
Wow.
And there are many individuals that can actually trace their origin to the original African Lodge number 459, a significant number there. So you will often see when people in America who are Masons, they'll have their name, they'll have their lodge number, and they'll have PH or PHA after it, which stands for Prince Hall. And a lot of the black musicians, like Nat King Cole, Duke Ellington, they were all members of Prince Hall Grand Lodge.
Mate, what a great chap. Wow, it's something I had no idea about. Thank you for that.
Well,
Good research. Good research.
It's certainly something very big in America. We don't see it out here. We tend not to see it in Australia. But when I've gone through America and I see this Prince Hall, it's always interested me. What is Prince Hall Grand Lodge?
Great choice, mate. Thank you very much. Well, that's our show for tonight. Thank you for joining us. Now, if you'd like to know anything more about Freemasonry, of course, just go to the website, which is freemasonsnz.org, or just call the telephone number on the bottom of the screen. Look forward to seeing you next week.